Moms and heads of households, I need your attention. Are you having trouble deciding between A2 cow's milk versus goat milk for you and your kids? Sure, you're questioning cow's milk, but is goat milk really a better choice? Well, if you'll stick with me, I'll show you why there are actually fewer differences between these two choices than is often portrayed, and also how to make the selection for the one that's right for you and your family. Are you feeling confused by the best dairy source for your family? I know the feeling. I've gone from vilifying dairy to using non-cow dairy sources to plant sources to now owning my own Jersey milk cow. Meet Millie. Ain't she gorgeous? Anyway, I have experience with this conversation and I want to help. I'm Arland Hill. I'm a regenerative rancher that helps introduce individuals to the value of animal-based foods to elevate their health in weeks, not months. And today, we're going to take a look at the role that dairy plays in that. But which dairy? Cow or goat? Well, as we get started today, let's clarify specifically what we're talking about. In today's conversation, I'm going to be referring to raw A2 cow dairy only, not A1, not the conventional dairy sources, but raw A2. And on the goat side, preferably raw goat milk as well. Now, something I want to bring up are when we talk about A2, we need to have an understanding of what animals are A2 producing animals, if you will, because this is definitely different than A1. And A1 is the majority of what you see when it comes to cow dairy in the United States. But the list of animals that produce A2 is pretty long, actually. In fact, I'll try to keep this short for us. Humans, moms, produce A2 milk, and ruminants produce A2 milk. So, for example, cattle, buffalo, goat, sheep, the animals that are in those categories, and even camels. But for us today, worldwide, if we look at which has greater consumption, even though we think about milk consumption predominantly being cow related in the United States, that's not the case worldwide. Overall, there's greater goat milk consumption than there is cow milk consumption when you total up the whole world use. Now, if you're looking at this video and you're trying to differentiate between cow milk and goat milk, and again, we're speaking raw A2 cow milk, some of the things that you're probably interested in are going to be, is there a difference when it comes to allergies? Are there differences in the nutrition between the cow milk and the goat milk? And are there benefits beyond that to the gastrointestinal tract and even to the immune system? And so what I want to do is break down each of those three for you and give you an understanding of how they compare in these three areas. So we're going to start off with the allergenicity, just the difference between the risk of developing an allergy between goat milk versus cow's milk. And so one thing to understand with this is that in general, goat milk is always stated as being the better option when it comes to allergenicity because it's a less allergenic milk. But as I really dug into this and started trying to find credible information to share with you here, that's not what I came across. In fact, I want to start us off with a study that actually references to the contrary and illustrates that those that have, that this was for a particular individual, more of a case study here, but it illustrates that sheep and goat's milk proteins were reactive for this individual, but they weren't actually reactive to the cow's milk. And so that's a different take than what we typically hear. Here's another piece of evidence that we can look at where we can see that there's allergies to goat and sheep milk, again, without having an allergy for cow's milk. And again, this is in direct contrast to what we hear. So what this suggests is that rather than being a universal application or a universal mindset that goat milk is less allergenic, there's really more of an individualism to this than is often portrayed. And when we think in regards to this difference in the response of the immune system as an allergy. Keep in mind that when we talk about goat milk, that unmodified goat's milk has been deemed not to be suitable for infants because of the high protein and mineral content and a low folate content. So I realize that there's certainly going to be some disagreement with that, as some individuals do use goat milk when mom's milk is not an option for infants. But this is what's portrayed out there. And in fact, you'll see that when we do this head-to-head comparison in this scenario that I'm referencing here for you, that goat milk has no clear nutritional advantages over cow's milk and is not considered to be less allergenic. And understand that too, that while we often hear that it's this either or, meaning that if you do react to cow's milk, that you won't react to goat milk. Well, again, this brings back into the conversation the individuality, and that's not necessarily true either, because we can see cross reaction between cow's milk and goat milk. Yes, they're different proteins, but there is still the possibility for cross reactivity here. Now, there's a bit more to this conversation, and I'll go a bit deeper here with you, and that is that some of this cross reactivity is going to come down to differences in breeds and just the whole allergenicity conversation. Let me not just limit this to cross reactivity, but the whole allergenicity conversation. There's going to be breed differences that are going to play an effect here. So for example, again, I'll go back to the cow. When you look at the Holstein, which is the typical dairy cow in the United States, that's an A1 version of milk versus your A2 breeds like your Jersey, your Guernsey, your brown Swiss usually. The same thing applies in regards to goat milk. There's obviously numerous different breeds for goats, and some goats are going to have unique differences in some of their milk characteristics. So we have to factor all of those things into consideration. But here's the main point about this is that don't assume that goat milk is automatically less allergenic than cow's milk, because the evidence doesn't support that. It really comes back down to individual differences there. Now, that's the allergenicity part. So let's transition now over to the differences in nutrition. And so where I want to start us at here is looking at let me frame this up. So goat milk is oftentimes stated as a more nutritious option than is cow's milk. And some of the things that are pointed to highlight that are going to be that it's going to be higher in certain fatty acids. I will caveat this for a moment and say that this is impacted as well by breeds. So some breeds are going to have higher milk fat content versus protein content, and that's true whether you're talking about goats or cows. So there's really not going to be this universality of it's just higher fats and certain fatty acids in goat. That really is also going to be related to the breeds. Some of the other things, though, that are stated in regards to the nutritional differences for goat milk is that it has prebiotics and probiotics in it. The protein content is higher in goat's milk. Some of the minerals are going to be stated as more bioavailable, calcium being an example of that. It's high in potassium. There's even some information out there about the forms of sodium that it has in it. But when you look at, let me just share this information here with you. When you look at this one study about cow's milk, I want you to notice what's said here is that bovine milk, so cow's milk, consists of various combinations of protein, lactose, fat, water, and trace amounts of other components. It also contains a substantial amount of vitamins and minerals such as B12, vitamin A, iron, calcium, potassium, and phosphorus. Does that sound like a nutrient-lacking food substance to you? Well, if you're not convinced, the study goes on to say even more. These microcomponents are essential for the body. So milk is delivering this cow's milk is delivering these essential components for the body, and it's serving as a comprehensive supplement for children during their developmental period and has a positive effect on adults as well. So it's beneficial throughout the lifespan. And to note that point even further, in broader terms, milk supports the intestine and immune system as a prebiotic substance, thus reducing the risk of diabetes and cardiovascular diseases. That's cow's milk, guys. So the conclusion here is that cow's milk is equally nutrient dense in comparison to goat milk. Now, let's dig into this a bit further. And now where I want to take you is looking at some of the statements that are made around the proteins, the fats, and really get into this conversation about carbohydrates. If you're of the mindset that the only carbohydrate that is in milk, whether that's going to be cow milk or goat milk, is lactose, you need to stick around because I have some knockout information for you that's going to completely change your perspective on the carbohydrates that are found in milk. But before we get there, let's talk about the protein. So when you look at the proteins in milk, and again, cow or goat here, it's roughly the same digestive characteristics. You're looking at about 80% casein and about 20% whey protein. And in regards to speed of utilization, whey protein is generally considered to be the fast uptake protein. It's utilized very quickly. And casein is utilized relatively fast as well compared to other dietary protein sources that are out there, but it's not as fast as whey. But the point here is that with all of these protein components and their similarities, you also have a third sector in here, and these are more found in the whey component of dairy. And these are going to be what are known as your bioactive peptides. And these are very slow to digest, and they're resistant to digestion. So those are important characteristics. So what that means is that they maintain their activity. And when you start comparing these in a cow source versus a goat source, what you're going to find is that there's very little differences in these protein structures and in the protein content. But remember that protein content in terms of ratioing that against the fat, that's going to be dictated a lot of times by the breed. I'll give you an example on that. So again, I told you about our Jersey cow. Jersey cows have higher fat content compared to protein content, but there's still both that are found in adequate quantities in the milk that she supplies. So that's protein. Well, what about fats? So fats, as I noted, there's breed differences here, but when you look at them in total, you're generally looking at a higher consumption of saturated fats. You're going to find other fats in there as well. But goat protein, one of the things that's often highlighted about goat protein is something called the milk fat globule membrane. I know that's a mouthful, but the point is that it helps with fat assimilation. And again, this is often talked about in reference to the goat, which would lead us to think that this is a unique characteristic of goat milk. But that's not actually the case because this is also found in cow milk and it's also found in human milk. So you're looking at some structural differences here, but in terms of that milk fat globule membrane that's going to help assimilate the fats that are in the milk, it's present in both. So when we say that there's a significant difference there because of that in goat, well, that's not actually accurate since it's present in both species, and actually all three species if we include humans. So that takes us up to now the carbohydrates. We addressed the proteins, we addressed the fats. Now let's get into the carbohydrates. And this is what I'm excited to share with you because this is not a conversation that is just about lactose. We want to obviously acknowledge lactose, and when we're talking about these raw forms of milk, we know that lactose is certainly much less of a concern because you have the probiotics already inherently in the milk that are going to help break down lactose into its galactose and glucose subunits so that those can be utilized. And yes, the lactose is found in both species. But that is not the only carbohydrate that is unique to milk. You also find in here what are known as oligosaccharides. Sometimes these are stated as milk oligosaccharides, but the oligosaccharide is the important part about that. And these are longer structures of carbohydrates. These are bigger carbohydrates. They're not huge, but they're bigger than what you find with lactose. Whereas lactose is 2 sugars, these are going to be generally between 3 to 9 sugars. And some of the things that have been shown as it relates to these oligosaccharides when it comes to goat milk, you'll notice here that we see prebiotic effects on that. So that prebiotic nature is going to enhance the productivity of the probiotics. It's also considered to be what's known as a pathogen trap. And that is a bit like it sounds. What it means is that it traps these pathogens that are going through the GI tract and it doesn't allow them to be problematic. It inhibits their activity. You also find it that these oligosaccharides are going to modulate the intestinal cells. You've probably no doubt heard the term leaky gut. And so when you think about leaky gut and these breaches and disruptions of the functionality of the cells in the GI tract, the milk oligosaccharides have the ability to modulate that so that those cells can function. They can remain tight when they need to. They can open up as they need to allow food substances to move through. So it just allows for a more functional, optimal integrity of the gut lining. In addition, it's also going to serve, these oligosaccharides are also going to serve as immune modulators. They'll prevent colitis, so inflammation in the gut. They support brain development. They support stress exposure, which when is there not stress exposure? And yes, when we talk about goat milk as it relates to these, goat milk does have a higher level of these oligosaccharides. And also when it has higher levels of what are known as medium chain fatty acids compared to cow's milk, your standard cow's milk. But here's what I want to point out on this is that this, again, is not something that is unique to goat's milk because these oligosaccharides are also found in cow's milk. What that means is that everything that I just shared with you in regards to those benefits that are unique for the oligosaccharides for the goat, well, turns out those are also unique when it comes to the cow as well. So you're also harnessing those benefits. So that takes us through your 3 major macronutrients there. Well, what about your micronutrients? Well, I already pointed out how there really isn't much difference here as well either. I gave you the list of things like potassium and phosphorus and vitamin A and calcium and iron and zinc. These are equally found in both species. Yes, you may find differences in nuances in different areas and regions where these animals are raised at, or the environment that they're raised in, or what they're fed. Those are all going to play a role in this, but by and large, the differences aren't really that significant. They're pretty negligible as a matter of fact. All right, next we're going to get into looking at the impact on the gut and the immune function. This was the other thing. This was the third point that we wanted to look at and see, does goat milk really have an advantage over cow's milk when it comes to the gut and the overall immune system? Spoiler alert, no, it doesn't. Goat milk does have higher amounts of caprylic acid. So caprylic acid, medium chain fatty acid, medium chain triglyceride, however you prefer to say that. And this does have direct antimicrobial benefits. To give you a specific example here, it can inhibit the growth of candida. It's very well known to be able to do that. But cow's milk also has these same type of immune and gut supporting activity, whether that's coming through the oligosaccharides, whether it's coming through direct introduction of the pre and probiotics. There's the bioactive peptides, which you're going to find in both species. There's really, again, no difference between goat and cow milk when you look at how it's going to support the gut or how it's going to support the immune function. And again, I haven't said this for a few moments, so I want to make sure I'm reiterating this. We are talking about raw A2 cow milk and preferably raw goat milk. So after listening to this so far, what would be your choice? Which one would you make? Well, tell me down in the comments below which one you prefer and give me a reason why you prefer that. But if we can't differentiate based on the allergy response or nutrition or the impact on the gut and the immune system, then how do we know which one is right for you? Well, here are a couple of other factors that can help you decide which one may be more useful for you between cow A2 milk and goat milk. So one of the things that we want to think about is taste. And there's some interpersonal variability on this, which is just probably a slick way of saying that what I like, you may not like, and what you like, I may not like, right? So there's going to be some individuals are going to have differences here. So when it comes to taste, in my opinion, there is a slightly stronger taste with goat milk. Now, granted, that can be affected by what the animal is fed. And is that significant? Not really. I really don't think it is. When I use goat milk, I don't really pay much attention to it, to be honest with you, but I do notice that there is a difference compared to cow milk. What about pasteurization? All right, so we want to try to avoid pasteurization when possible because that's damaging the proteins and negates some of the therapeutic activity in milk. And so it's just not ideal under most circumstances here, but it's also not always obtainable to get a non-pasteurized source. And if you're buying from the store, you're going to have to get a pasteurized source because that's what the USDA is going to allow to be presented to you in that store. So ideally, non-pasteurization, but with the understanding that you may have to buy a pasteurized source at times. All right, so if we talk about pasteurization, then we have to talk about homogenization. And this may be a term that is less familiar to some. So homogenization is the breaking down of the fat molecules so that they more easily disperse throughout the entirety of the solution in this case being the milk. And so when you look at goat milk, there is evidence to show that the homogenation process, this is a mechanical process, that is going to, and when I say mechanical, let me clarify, I'm just simply saying that as to mean a non-chemical process. So the mechanical process here of homogenization does induce changes to the protein structure. And we see that it's just not having an impact at the protein level. You're also seeing that it has an impact at the sugar level because there's impacts on the glycolysis and the gluconeogenesis metabolism. So that's looking at how the sugars are utilized. It's looking at how proteins are broken down and moved over to sugars to be utilized as energy source. Those things are all affected by the homogenization process on goat milk. But the reality is that this is not unique to goat. The same thing is likely happening when we talk about cow's milk as well. And what you would prefer to see is that you would ideally want to see that you've got separation of the fat from the rest of the liquid. That fat is going to rise to the top. And that is, if you don't homogenize, that's what you would expect to see. Now, of these things that I've talked about, your probability of finding these is much greater if you're buying a local source versus buying a store-bought source, which leads us into the final part of our content today, which is availability. And when you look at the availability between cow milk and dairy milk, and again, I'm sticking to the local conversation here for you, not what you can walk into the store and buy, is that think about this from the producer side for a minute. Cows are going to produce more milk per milking than goats are. They're just larger animals, right? So the consistency of availability is going to be greater with cow milk than it is with goat milk. And that you may be thinking, well, I've got a goat milk dairy right around the corner. Well, you would be the exception because the number of cattle dairies far exceeds the number of goat dairies, especially on a local level. I'll share a few things with you as a producer that I think are relevant to the availability component to this conversation. And it's just that cows are larger and more hardy animals. So that means if the stress of the environment, a hot summer, a cold winter, all those things start to play into the conversation, cows are just hardy animals. They can get through those types of environmental strains where smaller animals may not as easily do that and may require more uh, more modifications to the environment, not in a bad way, but just to maintain their care and to make sure that they're taken care of during those stressful times. And I personally think that cows are easier to manage. Not that goats are overly difficult, but just that cows are easier to manage because they're larger animals. And you may think that seems counterintuitive, but to me, putting the lead on our milk cow, moving her into her stanchion, which is her milking station, is really easy. She gets in this habit of moving, and it's not difficult for me to get her there at all. Now, keep in mind, though, that those that maintain goat dairies and move goats all the time into their milking stations, they're probably going to say, well, goats are really easy too. And I'm not going to disagree with that at all, because truly the handling of these animals is a byproduct of the animal husbandry and the interaction with these animals, more so than it is directly the animal. But something else to think about too, when it comes to the number of animals that you would need to sustain a goat dairy, you're going to need a lot more goats than you are the number of cows necessary to maintain a cow dairy, especially a small local dairy. And for me, for example, I have a beef cattle herd as well. So bringing a dairy cow into my environment is extremely easy because I have all the infrastructure already in place to manage that. Whereas when you look at trying to bring goats in, I'm going to have to manipulate my system. And so there's generally beef cattle herds are much more plentiful in the United States as opposed to a herd that would be related to meat goats, if you will. So I don't think you're going to go wrong with cow A2 milk or goat milk. And as long as they're both raw, you're going to benefit from both. However, I would initially steer you to the cow A2 milk because I think the probability of finding a local source is going to be much better for you and your consistency is going to be better. So now that I've compared these two milks with you, here's another comparison for you for raw milk, but this time it's against probiotics. Take a look at the video on the screen and find out who wins.